After years of navigating the restless pace of city life, this family sought a vacation deep in the woods to recharge their spirits. However, their peaceful camping trip took a dark turn when a grizzly bear attacked them. Did they survive the brutal encounter, or were they left with no chance to regret their visit? Join us as we explore their harrowing story. The Stevens family were residents of a bustling city and had long yearned for a break from urban life. Their dream of a remote wilderness adventure in Montana finally became reality when they planned a week-long camping trip. Henry, the father, had carefully prepared, excited to teach his children, Amelia, Owen, and little Elsie, how to fish by a secluded river. The family saw this as a much-needed bonding experience in the heart of nature. After a long drive, they arrived at a perfect campsite by the river just outside a dense forest. It was quiet, remote, and surrounded by Montana's rugged beauty. Together they set up camp, pitching their tent close to the water and building a fire pit. The first few days were blissful, filled with fishing, laughter, and peaceful nights under a canopy of stars. The children splashed in the river while Henry and his wife Laura cast lines into deeper waters. The gentle breeze, the tall pines, and the songs of distant birds filled their days with tranquility. Unbeknownst to the Stevens family, they had ventured into prime grizzly bear territory. That summer, food was scarce due to a dry season, forcing bears to roam further in search of sustenance. Though the family had taken basic precautions, they were unaware of the growing threat lurking just beyond the tree line. The river, rich with fish, attracted bears looking to fatten up for winter. On the fourth night, as the family settled into their tent, a deep silence settled over the forest. The usual night sounds, the buzz of insects, the occasional owl faded away, leaving an unsettling stillness in the air. Exhausted from the day's adventures, they fell asleep, unaware of the danger creeping closer. A massive grizzly, driven by hunger, crept through the forest. The lack of food had made it bolder, and the faint but alluring scent of fish drew it toward the river. As the bear approached the campsite, another scent caught its attention. Human. Cautious yet hungry, it ventured closer, associating humans with food. Under the cover of darkness, the bear crept toward the campsite, its massive form blending into the night. The tent and scattered camping gear intrigued it, but its attention soon focused on the tent. Inside, the family slept, their breaths soft and steady, invisible to most but not to the bear. Hunger and instinct drove it forward, inching ever closer, its dark eyes locked on the tent. The wilderness, once their dream escape, had turned dangerous. The predator, now only feet away, would soon shatter the peaceful illusion, reminding the Stevens family of nature's unforgiving side. Slowly, methodically, the grizzly circled the perimeter of the camp. It sniffed the air, picking up lingering traces of fish and food that had been cooked hours earlier. Driven by primal hunger, it ventured closer until its massive paws were just outside the thin fabric of the tent. The bear hesitated for a moment, its instincts wary of human presence, but the overpowering need for food overrode caution. It lifted one giant paw and swiped at the tent, ripping through the fabric with terrifying ease. The chaos that followed was instant and brutal. The bear, now fully committed, tore through the tent with unrelenting force, its sharp claws and powerful jaws searching for any sign of prey. Henry, the first to wake, had barely a second to react before the bear's massive form loomed over him. He reached out in desperation, instinctively trying to protect his family, but the bear was faster. It lunged forward, its jaws clamping down on his body with a sickening crunch. Blood stained the ground as Henry's body fell limp. Laura, now awake, scrambled to shield the children, but there was nowhere to run. The small confines of the tent offered no protection, and the bear was relentless. It swatted her aside, her body crumpling under the sheer weight of the attack. The children, terrified and confused, had no time to react. The bear's claws and teeth tore through the tent with savage ferocity, claiming one after the other in quick succession. Amelia, the oldest, tried to crawl toward the tent's opening, but the bear's powerful strike ended her desperate escape. The attack lasted only minutes, but the devastation it left behind was unimaginable. The bear, now sated and covered in blood, dragged the lifeless bodies toward the trees. its hunger temporarily quelled. It disappeared into the forest, leaving behind only carnage and silence. The following day, the campsite was a scene of horrific destruction. The tent was shredded, the ground stained with blood, and the fishing gear strewn across the area. A local search and rescue team, alerted by the family's failure to return on schedule, arrived days later. What they found was chilling: remnants of the family's belongings and signs of a struggle, but no bodies. The drag marks leading into the forest told the grim tale of what had transpired. The local community, though familiar with the dangers of living in proximity to the wilderness, was shaken to its core by the tragedy. Growing up in a village between mountains, Therese had always loved hiking. She had spent much of her childhood exploring trails, climbing boulders, and wandering through the vast wilderness that seemed to stretch forever. It was only natural that she wanted her children, Alden and little Karis, to experience that same joy, that same connection to the land now that she lives in the city. This was their first long hike as a family in years, and she had chosen a moderate trail, one that looped through some of the park's most scenic landscapes but avoided the more treacherous routes. The forest around them buzzed with life. Insects flitted across the shafts of sunlight filtering through the trees. Birds called out in the distance, and the occasional scurrying of small mammals echoed from the underbrush. Alden, the eldest at 12, was full of energy, bouncing ahead on the trail and examining every rock and plant with curiosity. Karis, only 6, was quieter and more contemplative, often sticking close to Therese's side, her little hand occasionally brushing against her mother's as they walked. Therese had packed light, just enough food and water for a day's hike, along with a small first aid kit and the bear spray she had clipped to her belt. The park was known for its wildlife, particularly the grizzly bear population that roamed the higher elevations. She knew the risks, of course, but they were far from the bears' usual feeding grounds. Besides, they had encountered no signs of large animals, no overturned logs or claw marks on the trees. Everything seemed peaceful and serene. The trail curved sharply as it wound its way up a slight rise, leading them into a secluded glen where the trees opened up to reveal a clear, shallow stream. The calm and clear water trickled over smooth stones, creating a soothing background noise. Therese decided this would be an excellent spot to rest. They had been hiking for a few hours, and while Alden still had plenty of energy, Karis was beginning to slow down. As the children splashed their hands in the stream and giggled, Therese kept a careful watch, her eyes scanning the forest line. There was a calmness here that felt almost unnatural, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The breeze had died down and the birds seemed quieter. A faint unease began to creep into her mind, but she pushed it aside, focusing instead on enjoying this rare moment with her children. After the break, they resumed their hike, moving deeper into the forest. The trail narrowed slightly as the underbrush thickened. It was then, without warning, that everything changed. The bear was massive, its fur a deep brown that almost blended with the shadows of the forest. It had emerged from a thicket to the side of the trail, just ahead of where Alden had wandered off to explore a cluster of rocks. Therese's heart lurched, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the bear stiffen, its dark eyes locking onto them. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, a terrible crushing stillness. The bear huffed, its powerful body lowering slightly as it shifted its weight. Therese knew immediately that this was not a passive encounter. The bear wasn't curious, it was defensive and territorial. They were too close and it felt threatened. In the space of a heartbeat, her mind raced through the options, the advice she had read in brochures and learned from park rangers. Stay calm, back away slowly, don't run. But none of that mattered now. The bear wasn't waiting. It wasn't giving them time to retreat. Therese's body moved before her mind could fully process the situation. She grabbed Alden by the shoulder, pulling him back toward where Karis stood, frozen in fear. There wasn't enough time to think, only to act. She shoved them both behind a cluster of large boulders, the jagged rocks forming a narrow alcove. Her heart hammered in her chest as she glanced over her shoulder, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The bear charged. The ground seemed to shake beneath its thunderous steps, the earth quaking with each powerful stride. There was no time to grab the bear spray. The bear was on her before she could even raise her arms in defense. The impact was brutal. The bear's weight slammed into her with the force of a freight train, knocking her off her feet and sending her sprawling onto the forest floor. Pain exploded through her body as she hit the ground, and her breath was knocked from her lungs. The bear was a blur of fur and muscle, its massive head looming over her, jaws snapping, claws swiping in quick, brutal motions. Teresa's only thought was of her children. They were hidden behind the rocks. Safe for now. She had to keep the bear's focus on her, and she had to give them time to stay hidden. Gritting her teeth, she kicked out with her legs, striking the bear in the chest. It barely flinched, only roaring in fury as it raked its claws across her side, tearing through fabric and skin alike. Agony ripped through her, but she held on, fighting back with every ounce of strength she had left. Her hands clawed at the earth, trying to drag herself away to create even the slightest bit of distance. But the bear was relentless, its powerful jaws closing down on her arm, the pain so intense it blurred her vision. Time seemed to stretch, each second a lifetime as the bear's rage played out on her battered body. In the periphery of her vision, she could see her children peeking out from behind the rocks, their faces pale and terrified. She wanted to scream at them to stay hidden, to run, but no sound came. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attack ended. The bear stood over her, panting heavily, its eyes scanning the forest. Therese lay motionless, every breath a struggle, her body broken and bleeding. She could hear the distant sound of footsteps, voices, perhaps park rangers alerted by the noise of the battle. But it was too late for her. The bear, having satisfied its defensive instincts, turned and lumbered away into the trees, its massive form disappearing into the shadows. The children remained hidden, trembling until the rangers finally arrived. They rushed to Teresa's side, but there was nothing they could do to save her. Her body was still, her breaths shallow, the life draining from her with every passing second. Yet, despite the pain, there was a glimmer of peace in her eyes as she gazed toward her children. She had done what she needed to do, and they were safe. In the aftermath, the park would remember Therese not only for the tragic loss, but for her bravery, for the mother who gave everything so her children could live. The Gautier family had finally escaped the noise of the city, retreating to a secluded lodge on the edge of a dense Montana forest. Surrounded by towering pines and rolling hills, Brant, his wife Lisbeth, and their children, Ansel and Etta, were eager to immerse themselves in nature. The lodge, far from any neighbors, offered the peace they desperately sought. As evening fell, they grilled dinner on the deck, savoring the crisp air and quiet atmosphere. The scent of sizzling meat filled the cool breeze, blending with the soft rustle of the trees. It was everything they had hoped for, perfect tranquility. But deep in the forest, a grizzly bear, weakened by hunger, had caught wind of their meal. Desperate for food, it ventured beyond its usual territory, drawn by the smell. Moving silently through the trees, the bear crept closer, its instincts overriding caution. Inside the lodge, the Gautiers relaxed, unaware of the danger outside. They had left the remains of their dinner on the deck, intending to clean up later. As they settled in by the fire, the bear reached the deck, rummaging through the scraps. Yet its hunger remained insatiable. The scent of food inside the lodge was overwhelming, pushing the bear to seek more. The family's peaceful escape was about to be shattered by the wilderness they had sought to embrace. Inside, the family heard the noise. At first, it was just a distant sound, a soft scraping that could have been the wind. But then the noises grew louder and more deliberate. Brant walked to the window and peered out, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the hulking shape on the deck. His mind raced, realizing what was happening. He backed away slowly, motioning to Lisbeth to gather the children. Before he could act further, there was a loud crash. The bear, having caught the scent of fresh food from the kitchen, threw its weight against the back door. The door groaned under the pressure, and in a terrifying display of strength, it splintered inward. The bear shoved its massive head through the opening, its snout flaring as it inhaled deeply. The scent of the family's dinner had overtaken its senses entirely, and now it wanted more. The family scrambled. Brant grabbed a nearby chair, instinctively raising it in defense, though he knew it would do little good against the beast. He waved it in the air, trying to draw the bear's attention, hoping to give Lisbeth and the children enough time to escape. Lisbeth hurriedly ushered Ansel and Etta toward the stairs, their faces pale with terror. The bear lunged into the kitchen, knocking over a table as it barreled through. Cabinets flew open as its claws swiped through the room, searching for the source of the smell. Brant stood his ground, heart pounding, as he waved the chair again, making noise to keep the bear focused on him. It worked for a moment. The bear turned its gaze toward him, its dark eyes locking onto the movement. But it was only a matter of seconds before it realized the food was not in his hands, and its attention shifted back to the kitchen. With a powerful swipe, it cleared the countertops, sending dishes and utensils clattering to the floor. Upstairs, Lisbeth and the children huddled in the small attic. The room was cramped and dusty, but it was the only space far enough from the kitchen. They listened in horror as the bear continued to tear through the lodge below, each crash and snarl sending shivers down their spines. Ansel's hands shook as he clutched his sister, both of them aware of the fragile walls that separated them from the chaos below. Brant, still downstairs, knew he couldn't keep the bear distracted much longer. The animal's hunger was insatiable, and it was growing more aggressive with each passing minute. The family's supplies were now scattered across the floor, a mixture of food and debris. In desperation, Brant retreated, moving slowly up the stairs, his eyes never leaving the bear. The bear, now fully inside, was a force of destruction. Its powerful jaws crushed everything in its path, knocking over furniture, tearing through the kitchen and clawing at the walls. But soon the scent of food began to dissipate, replaced by the strange, unfamiliar smell of humans. The bear paused, its head lifting as it sniffed the air again, its instincts on high alert. The family waited in the attic, barely daring to breathe. They could hear the bear below, the floorboards creaking under its weight. Every sound seemed magnified in the stillness of the night, and the minutes dragged on, each one more agonizing than the last. Suddenly, there was a heavy thud against the attic door. The bear had caught their scent, and now it wanted more. The door shook as the bear's claws scraped against it, testing the wood and searching for a way in. Brant braced himself against the door, his body trembling from adrenaline and fear. He knew the door wouldn't hold if the bear decided to press its weight against it. The hours that followed were a nightmare. The bear's persistence was relentless, its growls and snuffling sounds filling the small attic. The family could do nothing but wait, huddled together, praying that the bear would lose interest. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as the night wore on. Brant's muscles ached from holding the door, his breath shallow as he listened to the bear pacing outside. Eventually, just before dawn, the sounds began to fade. The bear, finally giving up, retreated into the wilderness, its hunger still unsatisfied but its energy spent. Brant collapsed against the door, exhaustion washing over him. They were safe for now. When the first light of morning crept through the attic window, they heard the faint sound of an approaching vehicle. Rescue teams had finally arrived, alerted by their emergency call hours earlier. The family was shaken but alive as they descended from the attic, greeted by the wreckage left behind by their uninvited guest. The peaceful getaway they had imagined was shattered, replaced by a night of terror that none of them would ever forget. The crisp Alaskan air filled Joran and Alara Van Holt's lungs as they stepped outside the luxury cabin they had called home for the past week. Their all-expenses-paid vacation was a dream come true, a retreat from the stress of city life and an immersion in the wild beauty of the Alaskan wilderness. The trip had been filled with guided tours through dense forests, breathtaking views of glaciers, and quiet nights under the stars. It felt like they were living in a postcard, but now it was their last day, and a sense of unfinished adventure hung in the air. There had been discussions of one final hike, something off the beaten path, a more intimate experience with the wilderness before they returned to reality. The guide had cautioned them against venturing too far alone, but Joran had reassured Alara. After all, they had been on several guided excursions, and the paths seemed well marked. How hard could it be? As they set out, the towering spruce trees closed around them like guardians of an ancient world. The forest felt alive in ways that Joran, an urban planner by trade, could barely comprehend. The crunch of their boots against the soft forest floor mixed with the occasional bird call, creating a rhythmic soundscape that lulled them into a false sense of tranquility. They walked for what felt like hours, marveling at the moss-covered ground and the distant mountains that occasionally peeked through breaks in the canopy. They had strayed far beyond the guided trails now, drawn deeper into the wild by their growing sense of curiosity. The land had an enchanting pull, remote, untamed, and indifferent to human presence. However, as the afternoon wore on, the charm of the wilderness began to shift into something more unsettling. The air grew still, and the sounds of birds seemed to vanish. Elara noticed it first, the eerie silence that now enveloped them. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. She glanced at Joran, her eyes wide with a dawning realization that they had wandered too far. Suddenly, the scent of something thick and coppery drifted through the air, a smell that sent a chill through their bones. It was unmistakable, the scent of blood. They had unknowingly entered a predator's domain. Joran motioned for Elara to stay close as they continued forward, a quiet sense of urgency now replacing their earlier curiosity. The forest, once inviting, now felt like a labyrinth designed to confuse and disorient. They crept forward cautiously, the underbrush rustling under their feet. Then they saw it. Through a break in the trees, the remains of a moose lay sprawled in a clearing, its body partially torn apart, crimson staining the earth. The sight was brutal, a stark reminder that the wilderness was not theirs to control. The scene was still fresh, the kill had not been there long, and nearby, its hulking form half obscured by shadows, stood the grizzly bear. Massive and rippling with muscle, the bear's fur was dark and matted with the blood of its prey. It raised its head from the carcass, its eyes locking onto the intruders who had dared to approach its meal. Joran's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit. This was no casual encounter with wildlife. They were in grave danger. Time seemed to stretch as the bear stood on all fours, towering over the remains of the moose. Its size was staggering, far larger than any bear they had seen during their guided tours. This was the true king of the wilderness, an apex predator at its most dangerous. And it was guarding its kill. Joran instinctively grabbed Elara's arm, backing up slowly, trying to show they weren't a threat. But the bear, territorial and protective, had already decided. With a deep, rumbling growl that reverberated through the trees, it dropped its head, ears flattening, and charged. The world exploded into chaos. The bear's sheer speed was terrifying, its powerful legs propelling it across the clearing in seconds. Joran pushed Elara behind him, trying to shield her from the inevitable. His heart pounded in his chest as adrenaline surged through his veins, but there was no time to think, no time to plan. Survival was all that mattered now. The bear was upon them. Joran barely managed to throw his arms up in a futile attempt to defend himself as the grizzly barreled into him, knocking him to the ground with the force of a freight train. The impact drove the air from his lungs, leaving him gasping and disoriented. Pain radiated from his chest, where the bear's massive paw had raked him, its claws cutting deep into his flesh. He fought to get up, but the bear was relentless, its weight crushing, its claws tearing. Elara stood frozen in horror, watching as the love of her life was savaged by the beast. Her mind screamed at her to run, to hide, but her legs refused to move. It was as if the forest had trapped them, offering no escape. Joran, fighting through the blinding pain, struggled to get his feet beneath him. He had to protect her. With what little strength he had left, he grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at the bear's head. It was a desperate, almost hopeless move, but it momentarily distracted the animal. The bear turned, growling in irritation as the branch cracked against its skull, but it did little more than enrage the creature further. In an instant, the bear's jaws clamped down on Joran's shoulder, dragging him across the ground like a rag doll. His vision blurred as the agony consumed him. Blood soaked the earth, and he could feel his body weakening with every second. But even then, his mind was on Elara. She had to survive. Ilara finally snapped into motion, her body shaking with terror. She tried to run, but the forest seemed to conspire against her, roots tangling her feet, branches grabbing at her clothing. She stumbled, falling hard onto the forest floor. As she scrambled to get up, the bear, finished with Joran, turned its attention to her. Joran lay on the ground, barely conscious, watching in helpless despair as the bear lumbered toward Ilara. He reached out, but his body betrayed him, refusing to move. His voice, hoarse and weak, was swallowed by the vast silence of the wilderness. Ilara's breath came in ragged gasps as she struggled to stand, but the bear was too fast. It swiped at her with a massive paw, knocking her to the ground with brutal force. She cried out in pain as the bear's claws tore into her back, the force sending her sprawling across the forest floor. The world around them seemed to dim, the forest indifferent to their suffering. The trees stood tall and unyielding, silent witnesses to the violence unfolding beneath their branches. The bear, satisfied with its dominance, lumbered back to its kill, leaving the clearing stained with blood and echoes of what had just transpired. Joran and Ilara lay motionless on the forest floor, their bodies broken, the final cost of their ill-fated adventure into the wild. The serenity of the Alaskan wilderness returned, undisturbed by the tragedy that had played out within its depths. The vast wilderness of Wyoming stretched endlessly, a rugged expanse of jagged peaks and dense forests. A group of Boy Scouts, led by the experienced Willem Torrance, had ventured deep into this untouched landscape. Willem, a seasoned scout leader with a lifetime of survival skills, was the ideal guide for the young boys who admired him greatly. The troop of 8 boys had spent the day hiking through dense forests, learning navigation by the sun and stars, and setting up camp by a river that meandered through the wilderness. Willem had taught them how to forage, build fires, and respect wildlife. As evening fell, the campsite buzzed with the sounds of crackling firewood, the boys' laughter, and the occasional snap of a twig in the surrounding woods. The setting sun bathed the horizon in amber and red hues, casting long shadows over the campsite. Exhausted from the day's activities, the boys gathered around the fire, eager to roast marshmallows as the sky darkened to deep purple. Willem sat nearby, his weathered face illuminated by the flickering flames, vigilant. The smell of roasting marshmallows and smoke mingled with the cool evening breeze. It was a peaceful night, with the forest unusually quiet, save for the crackling fire. Then, from deep within the trees, a shift occurred. At first, Willem didn't notice. The boys were engrossed in their laughter and conversation. But then, a low, deliberate rustling broke through the ambient noise. Willem's keen ears, trained by years of wilderness survival, perked up. He stood slowly, scanning the tree line. A faint grunt accompanied the rustling. Willem's instincts, honed from many nights in these woods, alerted him to potential danger. He had camped here often and knew the risks, especially in grizzly bear country. The smell of food, marshmallows, and leftover dinner might have attracted an unwanted visitor. His heart raced, not out of fear for himself, but for the unsuspecting boys who remained blissfully unaware of the looming threat. The moment stretched into tense silence as Willem's gaze remained fixed on the dark forest. Then, without warning, the massive form of a grizzly bear emerged from the shadow of the trees. It was a beast of staggering size, its fur matted and its nose twitching, drawn by the scent of food. The bear's eyes gleamed, hungry and curious, as it lumbered toward the campfire, its muscles rippling beneath its thick fur. Willem's pulse quickened. He knew what had to be done. With a swift but quiet motion, he gestured to the boys, urging them to move back toward the tents. They didn't fully understand, but the urgency in his expression told them to comply. He kept his focus on the bear, knowing that any sudden movement could trigger its predatory instincts. The firelight flickered in the bear's eyes as it came closer, its steps slow and measured, driven by hunger. The boys were now behind him, retreating into the tents just as Willem had signaled. He knew he needed to give them time to escape, to flee into the safety of the trees. But time was something he wasn't sure he had. His hand instinctively moved to the hunting knife strapped to his belt, the only weapon he had against the enormous creature. The grizzly was now only a few feet from the campfire, its head lowered, sniffing the air. Its massive paws, armed with long, lethal claws, dug into the dirt with each step. Willem remained calm, his mind racing through everything he had learned in his years of survival training. He knew grizzlies were unpredictable, and though they rarely attacked humans unprovoked, a bear drawn by the smell of food was far more dangerous. This bear, standing close enough that Willem could see the steam rising from its nostrils in the cold night air, wasn't going to be easily deterred. Willem shifted his stance, slowly drawing the hunting knife from its sheath, its cold steel catching the light of the fire. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, but he kept his movements deliberate, careful not to startle the bear. He could feel the weight of his years in the wilderness pressing down on him. He knew this fight wasn't just about survival, it was about protecting the boys. The bear paused, its head tilting as it noticed him for the first time. For a moment, man and beast locked eyes, and Willem understood that this was the tipping point. The bear's muscles tensed, its gaze fixed on him now, no longer interested in the food, but in the threat he represented. Then, with terrifying speed, the bear charged. Willem didn't have time to think, only to react. He leaped to the side, narrowly avoiding the bear's initial lunge. The ground shook beneath the creature's weight as it roared, a guttural, bone-chilling sound that echoed through the forest. Willem stumbled but managed to regain his footing, raising the knife in a defensive posture. The bear swung one massive paw, and Willem dodged again. This time the claws grazed his arm, tearing through his shirt and skin like paper. Pain shot through his body, but he gritted his teeth, knowing he couldn't afford to falter. The bear was relentless, its attacks swift and brutal. Willem struck out with his knife, the blade sinking into the bear's thick hide, but it barely seemed to notice. The grizzly roared again, enraged and charged once more. Willem could feel his strength waning, his body growing weaker with each passing second, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. He had to keep fighting and give the boys more time. With a final burst of energy, Willem slashed at the bear's face, the knife cutting deep into its muzzle. The bear reared back, momentarily stunned, and Willem used that moment to retreat, putting distance between himself and the beast. His breath came in ragged gasps, his vision blurring from the pain and exhaustion. The bear, wounded but far from defeated, began to circle him, its growls deep and menacing. Willem knew this was the end. He had bought the boys enough time to escape, but there was no more strength left in him to continue the fight. As the bear lunged one final time, its massive jaws closing in, Willem's thoughts were only of the boys, of their safety, of their future, and the hope that they would remember his sacrifice. The early morning air was cool as four friends ventured deeper into Yellowstone National Park. Jasper, 33, led with confidence from his years of backpacking experience. Lena, in her late 20s, followed closely, her quiet demeanor belying her keen awareness of the dense forest. Marcus, 31, tall and deliberate, kept the group's spirits high with subtle nods. At the back, 25-year-old Freya admired the towering pines and pristine landscape, her face reflecting serene appreciation. After 3 days of hiking through meadows and rocky ridges, they relished the untouched beauty of Yellowstone, feeling as if they were alone in a timeless world. Their heavy backpacks, packed with essentials like food, tents, and bear spray, had become familiar burdens on their many treks. On this day, they entered a dense forest where sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy, casting the woods in a dim, damp gloom. Pine needles crunched underfoot, breaking the thick silence that enveloped them. Suddenly, Jasper stopped. His raised hand caused the others to halt instantly. Ahead, the undergrowth shifted unnervingly. Then, as if materializing from the shadows, a massive grizzly bear emerged, her fur a deep brown that almost blended into the forest floor. But what made their hearts skip was the sight of her two small cubs trailing behind. Instinctively, they all froze. Jasper's hand reached slowly for his bear spray, and Lena followed suit, her fingers trembling slightly. Marcus's eyes darted from the bear to his surroundings, searching for any possible escape route. Freya's breath hitched, her wide eyes fixed on the bear. They knew all too well that a mother, grizzly with cubs, was among the most dangerous encounters in the wilderness. For a few tense moments, the group and the bear regarded each other in a standstill, as if suspended in time. The air felt heavy with impending danger. The mother bear snorted, her large head lowering as she huffed, her massive paws shifting slightly as if preparing to move. Jasper slowly began to back away, motioning for the others to do the same. They stepped cautiously, trying not to make any sudden movements that could be perceived as a threat. But it was too late. The bear's protective instincts flared. With a roar, she charged. The ground seemed to vibrate with the sheer power of her movement. The sudden, violent eruption of energy was like a force of nature, unstoppable and terrifying. Jasper barely had time to raise his bear spray before the grizzly closed the distance. He discharged a cloud of the substance in her direction, but the wind twisted, rendering it almost useless. Chaos broke loose. Lena screamed as she fumbled with her spray, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Marcus tried to stand his ground, holding the canister like a lifeline, but fear overtook him as the bear thundered toward them. Freya, in the back, instinctively turned to run, her legs pumping as adrenaline took control. Jasper was the first to be hit. The grizzly barreled into him with the force of a freight train, her immense weight knocking him to the ground. His bear spray rolled uselessly from his hand as the grizzly's claws raked across his torso. The violence was immediate and unrelenting, the sheer power of the attack leaving no room for defense. His body convulsed under the assault, blood staining the ground beneath him. Lena, just a few feet away, was paralyzed by the sight. Her brain screamed at her to move, but her limbs wouldn't obey. In a split second, the bear turned to her next, swiping with her massive paw. The force sent her crashing into a tree, the impact leaving her dazed. She barely registered the deep gashes that tore through her clothing, blood pouring freely from her side. She slumped, her vision blurring as the bear returned to Jasper. Marcus, witnessing the horror, made a desperate dash for a nearby tree. His long strides covered the ground quickly, but his sudden movement drew the bear's attention. She abandoned Jasper's lifeless body and charged after him. He reached the tree just as she caught up, her claws grazing his back as he leaped for the lowest branch. He scrambled up with every ounce of strength, the bark scraping against his arms as he pulled himself to safety, just out of the bear's reach. From his perch, Marcus could only watch in horror as the scene unfolded below him. The mother bear, in a frenzy of aggression, returned to Lena, her massive jaws closing around her leg and shaking violently. Marcus could hear the sickening crack of bones even from where he was. Freya had managed to make it farther into the woods, her legs burning as she sprinted. But the weight of her backpack and the uneven terrain slowed her down. The bear, having dealt with Lena, lifted her head, her keen senses picking up Freya's movement in the distance. She began to lumber in that direction, her speed unmatched by Freya's desperate flight. Marcus could do nothing but watch. His chest heaved as he clung to the tree, the smell of blood and sweat thick in the air. Freya's figure disappeared into the trees, followed by the grizzly. He could hear her screams, growing fainter as the bear closed in. Then, silence. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Marcus's breath was shallow, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he gripped the branch. He dared not move, his mind struggling to process the brutal violence he had just witnessed. Eventually, the mother bear returned. She trotted back toward her cubs, who had stayed hidden during the attack. She snorted as if satisfied that the threat had been neutralized and nudged her cubs away from the scene. Together, they melted back into the forest, leaving behind the broken bodies of her victims. Marcus remained in the tree for what felt like an eternity, paralyzed by the trauma. When he finally climbed down, his legs were weak, barely able to hold him. The scene around him was one of pure devastation, Jasper's and Lena's bodies torn apart, and Freya nowhere in sight. The survivor's guilt weighed heavily on him as he made the long, arduous journey back to civilization, his mind numb to the exhaustion and injuries he bore. His account of the attack would become a national news story, a grim reminder of the dangers that come with venturing into the wilderness. But for Marcus, the images of that day would never fade. The ferocity of the mother grizzly, the helplessness of his friends, and the suffocating realization that he had been powerless to stop it.